Kelly.
Good morning, David.
Executive Director of the Great Rivers Habitat Alliance. What do we owe the pleasure?
Well, there was an interesting article published in The Atlantic the other day, which people can see on our Facebook page for Great Rivers Habitat Alliance or
Yes.
my Twitter account on the National Flood Insurance Program. And with all the floods we've had in St. Louis over the past 2 years, it's interesting that the NFIP, as it's called, the National Flood Insurance Program, is up for reauthorization. And we're going to see if Washington, D.C. can exercise some fiscal discipline here and try to end the subsidies or reduce the subsidies at least in the National Flood Insurance Program. Because right now, unfortunately, our National Flood Insurance Program is pretty heavily subsidized by taxpayers, and that has got to change because that does one thing. It leads to more development and more living in the floodplain than you otherwise would, and that's not a good thing.
So basically what you're saying is they can build in the floodplain because they know if and when it goes bad, somebody's going to take care of them.
Yeah, to some extent. Right. You're required to get flood insurance if you're living or building in the floodplain.
Right.
And the fact that that program is subsidized makes it easier to do that. Now I have sympathy here. There's some people out there probably saying, but I was just notified out in St. Charles, they redrew the maps recently, and a lot of people who didn't think they were in the floodplain are now having to buy flood insurance.
Right.
And I have a lot of sympathy for those people because when they originally bought their home years ago, they were out of the floodplain. They
Right.
didn't think they were doing anything irresponsible.
Right.
And now, because of too many levees, too much floodplain development, our floodplain height is increasing. And you're seeing this all over the country, but it's certainly an epicenter right here in the St. Louis region. So these people who are now getting whacked with flood insurance costs annually, look, I understand and I sympathize, but I'm not sure that they shouldn't still have to pay
Right.
what the program costs. I think the harms of continuing to subsidize it are dreadful, and you really see it not only here in the St. Louis area, but along Louisiana, along the Atlantic coast, where you get this constant floodplain from hurricanes and other issues,
Right.
and yet taxpayers keep subsidizing those costs.
So first of all, flood insurance is not cheap.
It's not.
It can be expensive. It can be $400, $500, $600 a year. Easy, right?
Absolutely.
And so we are giving up tax dollars to incentivize people to build in floodplains. And then, because they're building in the floodplain, changes the direction of the river, which then makes my house in the flood zone. And so not only am I giving you a tax break, I'm going to have to pay flood insurance?
That's exactly what's happening to a lot of people out in St. Charles and elsewhere in this country. Because we've allowed so much floodplain development in Missouri, where our laws are too lax to do it.
Right.
And that's what happens. People has your house in Cottleville been put into the flood map?
Do they send you a letter telling you that you are? Yeah, I have not gotten a letter yet.
But you've got plenty of people who don't live very far away from you in
Right.
St. Charles who have been put into the flood rate maps this year.
Yeah, they are raising the road in front of us that's flooded a couple of times, but that, I don't know why it flooded so much, or who knows if it used to not flood or now does flood or whatever. But there are a couple of houses in my area, not necessarily in my subdivision, but that have flooded a couple of times, and they're just still living there.
So does it have to be like a certain amount of times that a house in the area that does flood that they can consider it a floodplain? Or
no, but for the flood insurance program, what happens is if your home gets damaged to the extent of 50% of the appraised value, then you're eligible for buyouts. And the problem here, and this is a key part of the article and a key part of this issue that needs reform, is that we don't enforce buyouts strictly enough. And what I mean by that is there's plenty of homes, nationwide, 1% of properties called repetitive loss properties account for 30% of flood insurance claims. Those are the ones that are in the floodplain for people who refuse to move, for people who know the game to some extent, meaning they know not to claim 50% of damage. Claim 40% of damage every time the flood comes, and you can get paid. And this is not a large number of people. Most people are not trying to to game the system and mess with flooding. But
Right.
some people are. Some people around the country are. And these are those 1% of properties that account for 30% of flood insurance claims. And part of the National Flood Insurance Program renewal, and Congressman Lutkemeyer, who represents part of St. Charles, is very actively engaged on this issue. He sits on that committee. You've really got to get more strict with this small percentage of properties that get so much money out of the
Right.
program and say, look, you're eligible for buyouts at 50% of damage, but also when you hit 100% of your appraised value,
Right.
we're kicking you out of the program.
Right.
You don't get any more. So take the buyout or
Right.
you're done.
Or you're allowed 2 or 3 buyout or 2 or 3 reimbursements, and then it's time for you to go. Something.
You've got to either move or I don't think anybody's going to send the marshals to the house to drag people out, but we can say next flood, you're completely on your own at this point. You're
Right.
not getting, you're not allowed into the flood insurance program, and we're not paying you a dime in the bailout. You've got to get out. That's a huge part of the problem, a huge part of the program that needs major reform.
Are other places in the country as bad as we are?
Absolutely, along the coast especially. Louisiana, the Gulf Coast, parts of the Atlantic coast.
Hurricane season.
or
But
hurricane season.
but they're not doing that to themselves though. They're not redirecting rivers and then creating more flood zones. That's because of whatever erosion and whatever else, right? That's more of a
Sure,
natural
but-
occurrence.
But I think you certainly get some floodplain development in those
Right.
areas that is helping make it worse.
Right.
And you certainly have that repetitive loss problem for people who don't want to move out of the coast of Louisiana
Right.
or parts of Florida and the Atlantic coast that are part of those repetitive loss issues. But your point is completely correct. Along the rivers, in our area and other parts of the country along
Right.
rivers, that's where we are doing this to ourselves. Too many levees, and every bit as important, if not more so, too much floodplain development, which we see over and over. We're in the midst of being flooded a couple months ago, and yet we're still still allowing floodplain developments
Right.
in St. Louis and moving forward on them in
but-
Maryland Heights and Lincoln County.
But like Minneapolis, Iowa, Omaha, are they building in floodplains the way we are, giving tax incentives to build in floodplains? I mean, that's just idiotic, as you've pointed out numerous times.
Those states that you just mentioned do have more strict floodplain development rules.
Right.
Minnesota, Illinois,
Right.
Iowa, although Illinois is unfortunately considering moving backwards right now.
Right.
Moving in the wrong. Missouri needs to move in the direction of Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois, not have Illinois move backwards with making it easier to develop in the floodplain.
Never dull when David Stokes comes in, Executive Director of Great Rivers Habitat Alliance. What's the website where we can find out more?
grha.org, and we really have an active Facebook page, Great Rivers Habitat Alliance, and follow me on Twitter at David C. Stokes. Always enjoy being on with you two.
You better suck up to us. Absolutely. 728, Big 550 KTRS.